Welcome to Never Again Is Now, a podcast about anti-Semitism. In this episode, we'll talk with Zuhdi Jasser, a Muslim reform leader, about Muslim reform and the relevance for Muslims, Jews, and others. I am Evelyn Marcus, and in addition to being a psychologist, I'm featured in the documentary about anti-Semitism, Never Again Is Now. I am a Dutch Jew and a daughter of Holocaust survivors. In 2006, I immigrated from Holland to the United States because of the rising anti-Semitism in Europe.
I am Phyllis Zimbler-Miller, the founder of the free nonfiction Holocaust theater project, ThinEdgeOfTheWedge.com. I grew up in the Midwestern town of Elgin, Illinois, not in a Holocaust survivor community. Our grandparents and parents had come at the turn of the 20th century to escape the Tsar. Yet in September 1970, only 25 years after the end of World War II and the Holocaust, my U.S. Army officer husband and I were stationed in Munich, Germany, and this changed our lives forever.
Zuhdi Jasser is a medical doctor in Phoenix, Arizona. A devout American Muslim, he is the president and founder of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, an American think tank for the principles of the U.S. Constitution, liberty, and freedom, through the separation of mosque and state. He served as a commissioner on the congressionally appointed U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, and testified before various government committees and routinely briefs members of Congress on the threat of political Islam or Islamism. He is the leading activist for reform of the Muslim world against the global movements of Islamism. He is the author of A Battle for the Soul of Islam, an American Muslim patriot's fight to save his faith. In the book, he offers a way for Muslims to dismantle the ideology of Islamism and reclaim their faith. Zuhdi Jasser helped found the Muslim Reform Movement, which has its goal to defeat theocratic Islam. He recently co-founded Champions for Liberty Against the Reality of Islamist Tyranny, the Clarity Coalition, and he is a member of the board of directors at Ayaan Hirsi Ali's Foundation Against Oppressive Traditions and for Liberty for All, the AHA Foundation. Zuhdi, welcome to our show. It's an extreme thrill and honor to have you on. Thank you for making the time.
Oh, thank you, Evelyn. The honor is all mine. It's great to be with you, and I've followed your work for some time, and it's just beyond humbling to be with you. Thank you.
Wow, thank you. That's great to hear. Thank you.
I get to ask the first question today, which is, how does your personal background relate to your work as a Muslim reformer?
Well, thank you, Phyllis. I appreciate that. And, I have to tell you, first of all, the term reformer, I rejected for some time. I think that reform is something that we might each do personally, but to be a Muslim reformer, I think, is something they might say about somebody posthumously, but not necessarily during their life. But having said that, that was sort of in the post 9/11 environment. And then the Arab Awakening happened in 2011, and we realized that the voices of reality, of honesty, of integrity, of clarity, if you will, about what's actually happening within the House of Islam were not only not loud enough, but not present enough. And so ultimately, many of us felt that we had to embrace the term reformer. And each of us, while, many of those of us who are part of this Muslim reform movement that we started in our American Islamic Forum for Democracy, launched in 2015, we each have our own pathway. And my pathway for getting there really is shaped by who my family is and who I am. My parents escaped Syria in the mid-'60s. Syria, as many of you know, is not only right now embattled in a civil war that started in 2011, but that has been a long civil war that has started since 1963, where the Baathists, which is basically the Arab form of Nazism, took over Syria. And Ba'athism has its Syrian form, its Iraqi form, and Saddam Hussein, and it's very similar to the Egyptian form of Jamal Abdel Nasser and the National Democratic Party, so-called Democratic Party of Egypt. And ultimately, they are a ruthless sectarian Arabist party, but it created an environment that radicalized generations of Syrians. And my grandfather, Zuhdi Jasser, was a businessman in Aleppo, was also a newspaper man, had a newspaper which later went to Lebanon. It was called Hayat. And out of Aleppo, he had very close relations with many of the modern thinkers that included a large Jewish community in Aleppo, and also wanted, after the French pulled out in 1947, to democratize Syria and create a parliament and a vibrant democracy. But unfortunately, that failed. He was one of the leaders in the People's Party, and the People's Party was destroyed by the radical elements of fascist parties. And there were 20 different coups that happened in Syria until 1963, when the Baathists took over. So ultimately, my parents came to America and embraced American freedom, and especially American nationalism. The national identity of America is that anybody could be an American simply overnight by believing in the social contract of the American Constitution, and basically being able to practice our first liberty, which is religious freedom. And thus, I was raised in a small town of Wisconsin that told me that I could practice my faith more freely, more devotionally, more pietistically in Wisconsin, in a little town called Dina, than I could in Damascus or Aleppo or any country that I thank God every day that my parents left, and I was able to grow up in America. So I will tell you that my background then created a sense of Islam that I later found out was sort of utopian and very personal, but not realistic as far as what the general status of Islam is around the world. But it's real. My grandfather on my dad's side, Zuhdi Jasser, was not only a businessman, but an intellectual, political, and scholarly leader. And my mom's father was a Sharia court judge that taught me Islam as my parents did, in a way that was intellectual. And thus that background led to me wanting to join the US Navy, believing that the only thing I'd ever want to die for is American freedom and American liberty and our Constitution. I'd never want to die for Islam or political Islam or the Islamic State. And I became a doctor. And ultimately, as a doctor, I was on a Navy scholarship through medical school, and we can talk about my service if you want. But ultimately, that shaped who I am, and shaped the fact that I felt that after 9/11, we realized that the primary problem is not a symptom of terrorism or a symptom of Al-Qaeda, but rather a root cause of political Islam or Islamism. And that ideology that Islam has not gone through a modernization of an enlightenment and reform. And as a physician, I treat diseases. I don't just cover up symptoms. And I felt that part of my service after I had left the military now was that it was a problem that only Muslims could solve. And if Muslims didn't step up and solve it, we ultimately would never solve the problem of jihad. And jihad is not a small problem. It is a quarter of the world's population are Muslim. And that population will continue to foster and be a fertile soil for radical Islamists and jihadists like a hydra, unless Muslims begin to reform the interpretations and practice of our own faith.
So, Zuhdi, what needs to be reformed in that respect? Can you explain it a little bit to us?
Yeah, I think, my grandfather used to say the West and Americans take democracy like oxygen. It's giving them the fuel of society and happiness, and yet they don't really understand what it is because they've gone through so many generations of being comfortable in democracy. Now, that's not necessarily true for Europe, which is barely 80 to 100 years from its obviously battle with fascism. But America's, founded in the late 18th century, has been a leading beacon of democracy. And, ultimately, that has been basically the guidepost, if you will, for me of what's needed for reform. It will take many generations beyond me for the Islamic theological interpretation to become compatible with Western society. But I think what can happen in my generation and in this generation is the separation of mosque and state, meaning that taking away the control of the legal systems, control of our personal bodily autonomy, my property rights, who I am as an individual, away from the clerics, the theocrats of Iran, the clerics of Wahhabism in Saudi Arabia, the clerics of the Sharia state in Pakistan. You have large countries and movements of hundreds of millions of Muslims that have basically been subjugated by clerics that interpret Islam by an ideology that is, we call, and in Arabic, it's called Islamism. In Arabic, it's called Islamiyin. So Islamism is the idea that the state identity, the flag, the national identity, the legal system of the state is all driven by one thing, which is Islam or Sharia and its interpretation, versus Western ideas of separation of mosque or church and synagogue and state is that the national identity unites. And I love the American experiment, which is under God. It unites under God, but not by any single faith. So the word Christian doesn't appear in our founding documents. And that, I think, is a template that I'm trying to get into Islam, which is you can believe that your laws are inspired by Islam or by Christianity or Judaism, but it can be a source, but not the source. That is the small difference. That is the huge difference. That is the uranium that fuels the nuclear entity that is the Islamic State. So when they say it's the source, then the only jurists that can rule on law are clerics, are Islamic Sharia experts and theologians, versus if it's a source, then the rest of us intellectuals can have input into what the legal system should be. And thus, yes, you will get input from Islamic clerics, but also there are secular laws, common law traditions, historical legal traditions that have many sources that make up what are the best legal systems. So, for example, I might choose not to drink, but I am strongly against any laws against drinking alcohol, etc., because I think if you believe in that system, then God should be able to judge me in a system where I choose to drink or not drink, choose to pray or not pray. So these things can't be coerced. And the best legal systems, I think, are those that give you the freedom to sin or not sin and practice these things or not practice them. So that reform, to me, at the end of the day, the short answer is the reform necessary is the separation of the legal and national identity from the Islamic or any faith identity, especially for Islam. So the flag should no longer be nationalistically Islamic, but rather ethnic or whatever, not even ethnic. In America, our patriotism is related to our united national contract as Americans, not as any particular ethnicity or any particular religious ideology. That is exactly the reform necessary. And I think that can happen. It's happening across the Arab awakening. It's happening across many. You see it in Iran this past few months, and it's happened in 2009 and 2019 also in Iran, where they're fighting against the theocrats, and the societies that they want are not to ratchet them back to the monarchy of the Shah or to ratchet them back to a Persian national identity, but rather to an Iran that is based in principles of human rights and universal human rights.
So how relevant are your ideas for America and Europe, where for the Muslim communities there?
So, that's a great question. Is we always try to compartmentalize the conversation about Islam and Muslims, where, okay, that applies to Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, but not in France or in Italy or in America. In France, where Muslims are 11% of the population, or in America, where it's barely 1.5% at most. And I can tell you there are two things to that are really important. Number one is you can only do the work that if we opened the American Islamic Forum for Democracy in Damascus or Cairo, it wouldn't last 2 months, and we would have a life expectancy of 6 months. So the reality is as dangerous as some of this work is, it's still much safer than doing it in the Middle East. So you can create the seeds, no different than you create the seeds of Google and YouTube and a lot of the media entities, economic entities that drive the world. You create them in the West, and then they float virally globally. You can do the same thing with religious reform ideas You have laboratories to do them here that you can't do anywhere else. And plus, we get it. We've been living here and understanding what religious freedom is when it's acted out. But also, it ends up, because we live it and take it for granted, we don't necessarily have the same drive that the Muslims in Iran do when they see their loved ones locked up because they don't want to wear the hijab, or they don't want to follow the dictates of the clerics. But still, in the West, it's also important, because what's amazing to me is how either ignorant or duplicitous a lot of the Western leaders are that are non-Muslim. For example, in France, they're finally getting around to asking Muslims that, listen, why are you in the West living in a separatist society where our French identity is based on laïcité, which is a separation of government from theology, from theologians, and yet you come here and set up societies and neighborhoods where you are separated from society, and you create your own little, stand, if you will, of Sharia state within those neighborhoods. And Macron and many others, as liberal as they are, have been very open on the fact that they will no longer tolerate separatism, and they're using the French term for separatism. So this is why it's important, is that security-wise, separatists are going to come in and despise the societies they live in, come in to not really reform and absorb the good ideas of French identity and American identity, but rather try to destroy them and evangelize the ideas of Islamism into their societies, as we saw with leading Islamists like Tariq Ramadan and his mentor Yusuf Qaradawi in Qatar, who recently passed, and the large media entity of Al Jazeera out of Qatar influences 60+ million Arab Muslims a day that watch that. And they don't just watch it in the Middle East. We have a globalized media right now. And to say that somehow Western societies are not immediately tied into the reforms that need to happen in the Middle East, also in the West, is folly, because we continue to have security threats with ISIS wannabes in Belgium and France and Germany and elsewhere, because they're connected and watching the same. They're not watching Fox and Sky News and Le Monde and all these other things. They're watching Al Jazeera and Telegram channels of ISIS and radicalism, etc. So the West needs to engage for security issues, and also, most importantly, actually, to your question, the reason I do this is not because I want to fix Islamic interpretation. I'll tell you, I don't, as a Muslim, my relationship with my faith is between me and God. I couldn't care how erroneously many Muslims might be practicing the faith. But the reason I do this is, as an American and also as a father, I will tell you that I worry that if I don't try to fix the incompatibility of Islam with Americanism, with Westernism, then ultimately my children will be radicalized, will have a conflict in their faith identity, and ultimately our country will not be safe. And if you look right now at the synergy of radical, far anti-Westernism that exists in far leftist networks that are very anti-Semitic, they're working together with Islamists, they're working closely with a lot of these radicals, and I can tell you that radicalism can only be solved if we begin to peel the onion of political Islam and Islamic reform that works very synergistically with it. So I do this because I love my country, America, and I want to see it safe and secure and exceed its expectations in the future. And right now, it's being driven by an apologetic, a domination of sort of this victim mentality for Muslims that is not only wrong, it's going to destroy our societies from within.
Let me throw a little bit of a monkey wrench in. Whenever we talk about this, we always talk about it as religion. But I can never forget the day after 9/11 when I turned on the television and a very high-ranking, I think the #2 in Al-Qaeda, said something about, "We will never rest until we reconquer Andalusia." Okay, if I mispronounce it, but you know what I meant. And I knew what he meant. I knew he meant the area of Spain, the Golden Age. And what worries me is that is part of it. And we don't talk about this drive to conquer other lands. And it really worries me. So does your group also work? How do you convince people who take that interpretation of Islam to say we must, once we've ever occupied a country, an area, it's our right to occupy it again? How do we deal with that?
So we have to be honest about the reality, which you are trying to do. And unfortunately, what happens is the vast majority, let me put this in context. There are about 1.6, 1.7 billion Muslims in the world. 350 million of them speak Arabic, okay? And the Arabic of the Quran, which is what we're trying to reform, is a very difficult, formalized, classical Arabic that even I'm a fluent Arabic speaker. I have to look up and look at many translations because the verbiage is very different. So a small percentage of a small percentage actually have the tools to reform the faith that needs massive reform on a global level. So a lot of these mandates of domination of the world, supremacist mandates of the land of Islam and the land of war is not being countered. But yet the reality is many Muslims in the West reject that and say, oh, I wasn't raised about the West being the land of war. This is nonsense. And then it gets dismissed. And the reality is, if you look on the bookshelves in their mosques, the books that they're ignoring have those ideas in them. The Sharia texts that are driving interpretation of our Islamic law, it says, kill those who leave Islam. It talks about Jews as animals and other things that is just horrifically anti-Semitic and hateful, and it's in the books there, interpretations from Saudi interpretations and otherwise. So what you're asking about is that the clerics right now, the ulama, which is the Arabic term for scholars, the scholars divide the world into the land of Islam, where Muslims are a majority, and the land of war, period. Now, the reformers, the Tariq Ramadans of the world that are the fake reformers will say, oh, we need to create a new third part of that, which is the land of contract, where Muslims that are living under a non-Muslim majority have a contract, which is as a citizen, where you don't declare war on them, but you basically follow the laws of the land and you're not an anarchist. That might sound moderate, but it is still supremacist, because they're still acknowledging that if they became a majority, they would want to ratchet them back to an Islamic state that has Sharia, that ultimately tells women they have half the vote of a man, a quarter of the inheritance, that they don't have bodily autonomy, that other faiths get their rights from Islam, not from God directly. All these kind of things are still part of the Islamic state mentality. So therefore, again, your question gets back to my answer, which is my original answer, which is the only way to defeat Islamic supremacism is to take away the nationalism out of Islamo-nationalism, is that we need to adopt a sense of a new ummah. Ummah in Arabic means our faith community. But interestingly, the Arabic in the Quran, ummah also means state. So therefore, we called in the reform movement for a de-ummatization of Islam, which means to take the state out of the concept of our faith and leave it just to being a faith community. As long as you had, look at every radical, when Saddam Hussein was losing control of his country, he put a Quranic scripture on the flag and made Iraq into this so-called Islamic state. Assad did the same thing. Many of the Islamists in Egypt are secular fascist leaders from Nasser onwards, but ultimately had a relationship with the faith leadership that was about fascism and faith domination. So yes, the Arab dictators are less of a threat than the Islamist ones, because they don't have global ambitions like the Islamists did in Spain or Andalusia and others. But at the end of the day, those are two poles of the same evil, which is supremacism. And to defeat that, we have, and that's why we formed this Clarity Coalition that Evelyn was talking about in the introduction, which is champions for liberty against Islamist tyranny. And it's not just that we're against political Islam, but what are we for? We have to be for liberty, for a society that's based in the equality of all under the Constitution and under our legal systems. And that's something that Islamists would never agree to, whether it's in the land of Islam or the land of contract, which is what they try to deceive us and dissimulate us into believing they do.
Great. And I would invite everybody to look up the claritycoalition.org, where it explains more about this coalition. I'm personally also a member of it. According to the surveys of the Anti-Defamation League and other surveys, Muslim populations across the globe harbor more anti-Semitism than other populations. Would Muslim reform diminish Muslim anti-Semitism? And if so, how?
So, Evelyn, there is no reform if there's no targeting of anti-Semitism in the ideologies of political Islamists. You can't, it is disingenuous, and it is bizarre to me sometimes how I talk to folks that are working on Muslim-Jewish dialogues, and they will say, "Oh, well, we don't even get into Israel, and we don't get into the Jewish question because the bigger problem is jihad globally." And Muslim reform is the bigger issue, and we don't want to politicize it, etc. And listen, if they're honest about the Quran, the way I was raised, if you look, the only state actually referenced in the Quran is Israel. So, as a reform-minded Muslim, I can tell you that actually the legitimacy of the state of Israel is verified and proven by an embrace of a interpretation of our Quran that recognizes the people of Israel, the Jewish tradition, and the equality of it with Islam. Part of reform is to acknowledge that we don't have an exclusive path to God. So how can the same Quran that the Saudis interpret to say that we should not take Jews and Christians as friends also be the same Quran that God tells us that we can marry a Jewish spouse and then she should not have to convert, that she can stay Jewish as my spouse or any male spouse and yet raise the kids as Muslims and yet continue to be Jewish. So that same type of pluralism cannot exist in a conflicted transmission of message from God. So how does that come to fruition? The bottom line is the term friend that is being interpreted as friend by the Saudis is awliya, which has to do with actually legal representation in religious courts. So yes, if you talk to a Catholic and they find somebody to be their godparent and they have a arbitration court, Catholic law needs to be meted out between Catholics. So ultimately, there's no doubt that if there's that passage that the Saudis are saying don't take Jews as friends is actually about we should not have them be representatives within our own legal entanglements that might happen within a court system. So that doesn't mean that they don't have their own pathway to heaven and have their own faith tradition that we respect. So that's part of how reform needs to happen. And I can tell you that all of this unsuccessful or window dressing type interfaith conversations that happen between Jews and Muslims happen because all they deal with is the similarities and they don't deal with the differences. And only interfaith conversations that are successful are when they deal openly and even early on with the differences. So in the chapter 5 that talks about Jews, especially critically regarding some wars that might have happened or conflicts, true, honest Muslim-Jewish dialogue needs to engage on what is the interpretation of the chapter of Al-Ma'idah and what is that chapter, what is the interpretation of what happened with the Jews of Banu Qurayza, with actually how it applies to today or it doesn't. We talk about in reform about separating history in the Quran from religion globally today. And that's a very, very important distinction. And if Muslims can't do that, they are not only are they dishonest, but they actually become very harmful partners for the Jewish community because it will become simply window dressing and not real reform.
I was going to ask you this question, but I think you've already answered it. Why it's important for this reform, besides for Muslims and Jews, and it's because of the trend in the world now towards nationalism, which Islamism is promoting, and how we have to denationalized. I mean, I do a lot of research on the Holocaust in this period before. I'm not an expert, but one of the things that's really hit me is at one point, the Jews really believed that they belonged to a European society, that they weren't so much, not everyone, not meaning to generalize, but that the intellectuals believed it was a European society and not Austria, et cetera, et cetera. But today, Islamism is much more pushing towards this national state. Now, how do we push back on an individual level?
Okay, I'm glad you asked me that because, you know, we have to thread that needle of national identity. And what do I mean by that? When I talk to Muslim kids, what creates the jihadi cool, it's called jihadi cool, which is jihadi cool mentality where they want to become jihadists, is they end up wanting to find a cause that gives them purpose, that makes them feel that no matter what happens, whether they die or not, they've lived a purposeful life. Well, when I joined the US Navy, as I mentioned to you early on, the only thing I would ever want to die for is America, is our Constitution. And I think ultimately most sentient, emotional, vibrant human beings want to have something they believe in closely. They have a close relationship with somebody they love in their marriage, their family, and then with their country. So national identity, patriotism, I think, is absolutely necessary. It is the only antidote to political Islam. And that's why globalism can be a problem if we dissolve national identity. But having said that, hyper-nationalism, which is ethnic fascism that can occur as the Jews have suffered from through Europe, that occurs with whether it's Nazi fascism or whatever identity it might be, because it's based in ethnicity and based in race, can be very, very toxic and has proven over history to never be a solution for creating a successful social contract. So you need to marry national identity to a social contract that's based in equality, that is blind to religion, race, ethnicity, and is protective of free speech and freedom of religion, et cetera. All of our Bill of Rights, especially the First Amendment, if you will, in the US Constitution, is tied to a national identity that is about Americanism. And that's why the best antidote I see for Islamism is Americanism. But you have to thread that needle. And you know, my book, A Battle for the Soul of Islam, and I will do a shameless plug of it.
No, that's fine. No, hold it higher. Your hands got in the way of the title. Okay.
Yes. So my book, A Battle for the Soul of Islam, if you will, has Arabic script on top, and then on the bottom here is the US Constitution. And ultimately, that is the main conflict. And the first part of my book talks about my own background, as we talked in the beginning of the program, and then how that fueled, if you will, my understanding that the only way to defeat political Islam or Islamic national identity, because I'll tell you, Islamic national identity, the Islamists see simply as a little footnote, because to them, the bigger thing is the Islamic Empire, the Islamic Caliphate. Yeah. So neo-Caliphism is about creating little small states that they let them become a Pakistani Islamic Republic, an Iranian Islamic Republic, but they will create one caliphate. The only way to counter this is we as Muslims to believe that we will want to defeat political Islamic states by living in lands of liberty and freedom. And I have to tell you, for those Muslims that are worried about anti-Muslim bigotry and what they call Islamophobia, a term that I reject, but there is some anti-Muslim bigotry that exists, the best way to do that is for Western citizens to see us as the solution, as a solution to the threat of political Islam, and not as apologists, as people that are always blaming the West, blaming others for our own problems. Because I think that's one of the biggest sources of anti-Muslim bigotry, is where we constantly portray ourselves as the victim to the Western issues, when in fact, Westerners see that as lying, as deception, as dishonesty, where we blame Assad on Israel or on some other nonsense, when in fact, Assad is about Arab fascism. It's not about anything related to the West. And all of these other entities are conspiracy theory driven. And it gets back to your question about anti-Semitism. One of the reasons anti-Semitism is fueled by political Islam is that political Islam thrives on conspiracy theories of the other. and conspiracy theories, as we saw with the protocols of the Elders of Zion and other fabrications that have radicalized Western anti-Semitism that exists in the West and in Europe. Islamist anti-Semitism is driven by conspiracy theories and other fabrications.
How helpful are Jewish communities and other communities in America or elsewhere? How helpful are they to the interpretation of Islam and the changes of interpretation that you have described so far in this episode?
You know, well, I'll tell you, Evelyn, they are only helpful if they marginalize and they call a spade a spade when it comes to supremacist ideologies. If they're partnering with Muslim Brotherhood legacy groups and apologists for political Islam, like the Islamic Society of North America, the Council for American Islamic Relations, and other groups that are pretty much launderers of Islamist supremacism, if they partner with, and they're launderers for the misogyny of political Islam, they're launderers for anti-Semitism that exists, and they're in complete denial. If they partner with them, they're going to not only make our job harder, but it's going to create the exact opposite effect. So ultimately, you know, the reality is, you know, so how do you find these partners? You have to work a little harder. You can't expect that overnight, if you partner with some Muslim organization, that they're going to fill a hall of hundreds of people with people that are part of this synergy of Jewish-Muslim dialogue. So the bottom line is you have to understand where Muslims are in our history right now. We are not at a stage in which the reform movement is a major populist movement like that's happening in Egypt or Iran, where you had people in the streets against dictatorships and against tyranny, because there hasn't been enough fire under the feet of Muslims that are living comfortably in the West. And having said that, that's why, to me right now, our partners can begin to, it's better to find 20 or 30 leaders that get it and embrace them and work with them than to work with organizations that are simply the low-hanging fruit. And I've said this not only to the Jewish community, I've said it to the FBI, to American government security leaders, to universities that are looking for professors and others to work with. I'll tell them it's better to work with 1 or 2 professors that have written about the toxicity of political Islam than with the 20 that are in bed with the Middle East initiatives that are anti-Semitic and anti-Israel and pro-radical Hamas and other groups that are apologists for these groups. So ultimately, I'd ask my Jewish partners to not have a bigotry of low expectations themselves, is to hold our Muslim community to higher standards, to equal standards, that if they're going to partner with you, then for crying out loud, then they need to talk about the equality of men and women. They need to acknowledge that Sharia texts are misogynists, and that there right now is no Muslim majority society or country that embodies any of the principles of Western freedom and liberty of the 21st century. Without that type of honesty, those are not your partners. And that's why, you know, if you look at data from the ADL and others, the anti-Semitism is over 90% in many Muslim majority countries and societies and communities, because of how toxic and how uncritical the West has been. And we're going right now, when we talk about China, we see that the FIFA soccer World Cup is in Qatar. You're having initially now finally some conversations about the reality of American companies fueling and turning a blind eye to what's happening in China, to what's happening in Qatar and Saudi Arabia. These conversations are the exact same ones that we're having right now about who's the best partner. So if our corporations are partnering with supremacists and with dictatorships, then we see the same thing. That partner fuels radical ideas. So it's the same thing with our local communities. If you partner with folks that have the wrong ideas on the dinner tables, then it's going to end, even if many of them end up lying publicly about what they really believe. Do they say the same thing on the dinner tables that they do publicly? And that's the minimum standard, is that they should be honest about what they say to their kids at home about the Quran versus what they're saying on television and in the synagogues when they have Jewish-Muslim dialogues.
I think those who want to partner with Islamic organizations, Muslim organizations in the West should first consult you about who they have in mind and get your perspective on that.
Let me add one thing. We have I brought another prop here, but this is the Muslim Reform Movement Declaration. It's a 2-page declaration. That's it, 2 pages, and it's signed by 20 of us that believed that we rolled up our sleeves and we figured out, okay, what is the firewall that would define for those people that are watching here today and listening and say, well, how do I know if somebody's an Islamist or if they're lying to me? This has basically 3 sections. It has a section on national security, counterterrorism, foreign policy, a second section on human rights, which is about women's rights and minority rights, and a third section on secular governance, which is free speech and religion. And we have principles listed on this declaration, which you can find at our website, muslimreformmovement.org. And to this has been public now for 7 years. We did it in 2015. And there's not been one takedown of it by Islamists. They haven't been able to attack it because they realized that they would never sign on to this. It says, we stand for the protection of all people of all faiths and non-faith who seek freedom from dictatorships, theocracies, and Islamist extremists. We reject bigotry, oppression, and violence against all people, against any prejudice, including ethnicity, gender, language, belief, religion, sexual orientation, and gender expression. And then we go on. The statements here would never be accepted by Islamists. And that's all. If you're going to find somebody to partner, have a conversation about our declaration, see what they think. And I think it'll begin that conversation. And then you can help us by finding folks that you can refer to us so that we can broaden our own network.
Or partner with you, with
Yes.
the Muslim Reform Movement.
And it's our time is coming to an end, and we're going to give you a last chance. But the kind of document that you just talked about is this similar to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance non-binding working definition of anti-Semitism. And we need these guides to help us clarify what is and isn't anti-Semitism, what is it and isn't appropriate Islamic, wait, did I use the word correctly, positions. So thank you, and we'll figure out a way maybe to link to that somewhere in our material, because we would love to share that. And okay, your chance to say your last words before we end this unbelievably engaging talk.
Well, thank you for all of this and for giving us your time and a platform. And I'll tell you, just please hold your Muslim friends accountable. Don't sort of dismiss the reality of some of the ideas that they have and allow them to become apologists or victims. And I'll tell you, go to our website, aifdemocracy.org is our website that talks about the different platforms that we have to separate mosque and state and advance the ideas of reform. And, you know, we're not trying to take away the free speech of Islamists. We want to have a platform where we can debate them. And I can tell you, when we launched, I was having debates against imams. I probably had 12, 13 debates of imams from Columbus to Milwaukee to Phoenix and New York. Now they won't debate us anymore, because I will tell you, almost 80 to 90% of Muslims that were watching these debates would say, oh my God, now I understand what's wrong with our leadership. And they realized that it was one of the most ineffective things they could do, the Islamists, which is to engage us. So I will tell you, if there's one message I have, please, if you're watching this, have our Muslim Reform Movement leaders, which includes folks in Canada like Raheel Raza and Ezra Nomani in Washington and others in Europe like Osama Hassan in London. There are many of us Muslims that are ready to engage Islamist Muslims and expose the reality of their ideas. We want the sunlight to be the antiseptic, so that they have the free speech to expose how incompatible their ideas are. So we're not trying to take away the free speech of the Council on American Islamic Relations. No, they're their own worst enemy. The problem is they get laundered by modern regular media that doesn't really hold them accountable and ask them tough questions. And we're ready to ask the tough questions and give the tough love to our own community in the Muslim community, so that we can reform and move forward. Because at the end of the day, I love my faith, and that's what my book is about, A Battle for the Soul of Islam. And I'll hold it up one last time. Take a look at it online, and continue. And thank you, Evelyn and Phyllis, for all that you do. It's been great working with you, Evelyn, so far on the Clarity Coalition. I think that coalition is going to be a great broadened platform for the work of the Muslim reform movement. Thank you.
Thank you, Zuhdi.
So much for this engaging talk. Thank our listeners for listening. I hope you follow his advice about holding Muslim community members that you work with accountable. Please, for those of you who have not yet watched Evelyn's documentary, Never Again Is Now, you can see it on Amazon and YouTube. You can learn more information about my free nonfiction Holocaust theater project at thinedgeofthewedge.com. And as we end every podcast, we say, please, without putting yourself in physical danger, speak up against anti-Semitism and all hate.